record.
Also, hi, Kiran. I've been having technical difficulties, so sorry. I'm going to pop my camera on once I fix all of this that's going on. But yeah, Thank you so much for coming to speak.
No worries. Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, I'm gonna let them in now.
Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We can go ahead and get started. So welcome to our Asian Youth Liberty League event featuring Kiran Bhalla, the project director at the AAPI Equity Alliance. The organization is dedicated to improving the lives of Asian Americans through civic engagement and activism. Today, she's going to be speaking about the rise of anti-Asian hate incidents across the country. We're going to have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, so you can just put your questions in the chat and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. So thank you all, and Kiran, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ayush. Thanks to all of you for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and tell you a little bit about our work. I am going to go ahead and share my screen right now. Let's see. Can you see the screen? Okay. All right. So thank you to Ayush in particular for inviting us. I know he had moderated a panel where our executive director, Manju Kulkarni, had spoken earlier this year. And we really enjoy talking to all sorts of organizations. So we're glad you guys are interested and excited to learn a little bit more. I am going to try and keep my remarks to 30 minutes or less because I know we only have about 40 minutes on this Zoom. So hopefully we can get to some of your questions at the end. That's usually the best part about this. So I'll try and get through this a little bit quicker than I usually do. But so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about understanding hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I'll be using the acronym AAPI, which refers to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout the presentation. So I just want to let you know like what the plan is for today. I want to tell you a little bit about the organizations that I work for. I want to touch a little bit on the origin of Asian Pacific Heritage Month because it's tied directly to the work that we do. I'll go very briefly into a little bit of AAPI history in the US. And then I'll tell you about the data that we collect, what the hate looks like that we see, what are some of the causes of that and some of the effects of that. And then we'll get to solutions, what AAPIs think are the solutions, how we see the challenge and how we try to address it at Stop AAPI Hate, and what you can do. So let's get started. So my name is Kiran Bhalla. I am a project director at AAPI Equity Alliance. We are a coalition of 40 plus AAPI organizations in the greater LA area. And our organizations work in a variety of ethnic communities under the AAPI umbrella. And they work on a variety of service areas. Some work in mental health, some work in legal services, some work in civic engagement, some work in youth services. So there's a wide variety. But 40 or 50 years ago, some of the executives at these organizations came together and they said, hey, you know, we need to start coordinating. We need to start collaborating because we're doing our day-to-day work, but we need to give voice to all of the common things that we do and to advocate for our groups collectively. So AAPI Equity Alliance was born of that. And then in March 2020, our co-founder, our executive director, Manju Kulkarni, she joined with Russell Jung at San Francisco State University and Sin Che at Chinese for Affirmative Action. And the three of them were talking, and they were seeing a number of incidences of anti-AAPI hate. They heard about it from friends and family, they saw it in the media, and they knew based on the history of AAPIs in the US that it would likely get worse. And they also knew that nobody was collecting this data. So they initially went to the California Attorney General's office and they said, hey, would you collect this data on anti-AAPI hate incidents? And the Attorney General's office declined. They collect data on hate crimes that are reported to the police and referred to the local attorney's office, but they don't collect data on incidents, cases that don't meet the threshold of a crime. So there was clearly a need for somebody to be collecting this data, and so Stop AAPI Hate was born. We put a form up on a website where anyone can come and report an incident that they've experienced. So there's no sort of barrier, in the sense that oftentimes we hear people say, well, I tried to go to the police and they wouldn't take my report. They wouldn't write it down, they wouldn't file it, there's no documentation of it. But here there's sort of no barrier. If you can get onto the internet, you can fill out a form and submit it. So you can tell us what happened to you. So I will get into some of the data that we see based on those reports to our website in a little bit. But first I want to give you a little bit of background. So when I learned where Asian Pacific American Heritage Month started, I was like, wow, this connects directly to the work that we do. So many of you may know that Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is in May, and it's a time to celebrate food and culture and stories and histories. But its origin story is really interesting. So in the late 70s, a woman named Jeannie Ju went to Congressman Frank Horton and asked for some time nationwide to celebrate Asian American history and culture. And many years later, Representative Horton shared the story, and he said the story of the origin. He said that Jeannie's great-grandfather, M. Wiley, had been an immigrant from China in the 1800s. He helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. And later on, he became a prominent California businessman. But in the late 1800s, there were many periods of anti-Asian and specifically anti-Chinese sentiment and unrest. And during one of those times, Mr. Lee traveled to Oregon and he was killed. And so Jeannie came to believe that not only should Asians understand their heritage, but that all Americans should know the contributions and the histories of Asian Pacific Americans and their experience in the US. So I just think it's fascinating that the origin of Asian Pacific American heritage stems from an incident in the late 1800s. And we are working on some of those same issues through Stop AAPI Hate today in 2022. So I just wanted to put that out there as background. A little bit more context. There are 24 million AAPIs in the United States. Their population has seen a tremendous amount of growth. So there's been an 80% growth from 2000 to 2019. It's the fastest growing racial group in the US. And the population will more than double in the next 40 years. So it's not a small group, and it is growing. So, and it will have an impact down the line. So the things we do now today, the things that you guys do today, they will matter, not just today, but down the road, this generation, the next generation. I also want to mention that oftentimes folks think about AAPIs in the coastal areas, on the East Coast, the West Coast, but AAPIs live and work throughout the 50 states. And we receive stories of hate incidents from all 50 states. So it's a widespread problem, it's a nationwide problem, and that's sort of why we were born as a coalition, in order to sort of address this and tackle this nationwide. I'm going to really briefly touch on some early moments in AAPI history. We often tend to think of AAPIs as being recent arrivals to the United States, when in fact AAPIs have been here since the very beginning, since before independence even. There were many Chinese and Filipino sailors who came on Spanish ships that were running trade routes from the Philippines to North America. They went back and forth, and sometimes some of those sailors, they said, you know what, I'm done. I'm going to get off. I'm going to stay on land, and I'm going to start a business and a new life. So one of those incidents we know of is in 1625. Some Chinese seamen disembarked in Mexico City, and they decided to become barbers. And this caused some consternation among the local barbers, and they complained about the competition. And I just mentioned this because we will see this again. We see this again in the 1800s, and we see it again today, where there's this sort of xenophobia, this fear of economic dislocation, and sometimes it plays out in violence against AAPIs. So I'm gonna skip through the rest of this because we are a little bit short of time today, but hopefully some of the things mentioned on this slide give you some ideas for things to dig deeper into in the future. My next slide also talks a little bit about history. And I just want to share with you a little bit some of the laws and policies of the US government throughout history that have been exclusionary and discriminatory, and some of the violence that we've seen against AAPIs. It's not a one-to-one correlation. It's not that this law happened and this bit of violence happened, but these laws set the context that violence then occurs in. So very quickly, right after independence, we have the 1790 Naturalization Act. And Asians were excluded from becoming citizens. They could, if they were here, they could be here, but they couldn't become citizens. After the Civil War in 1870, we have another Naturalization Act. Again, Asians are excluded from becoming citizens. In 1875, we have the Page Act, which specifically excluded Chinese women. They were sort of objectified and sexualized, and there was a fear of them coming, and so they were kept away. That was extended to Chinese men in 1882. And in 1913, we had the Alien Land Law. So this law was a California law, and it said that immigrants could not own land. They could be renters, they could be tenants, but they could not be property holders. And this was copied in a number of other states afterwards. And it affected people's lives, right? It was a barrier to becoming an American in America. In 1917, we have the Asiatic Barred Act, which limited immigration from Asia, from a large portion of Asia. And in the 1920s, we have these immigration quotas, which severely limited immigration. And then in the 1935, we have the Filipino Repatriation Act. So the US government tried to subsidize the return of Filipinos back to the Philippines. Very few Filipinos took the US government up on this offer because they knew, because of the immigration quotas, if they left, they were very unlikely to be able to return. So the US government tried to get people to leave. It didn't work out too well. It's not until the 1965 Immigration Act where the doors of immigration are opened up to a much wider audience than ever before. Many folks from Asia came, many folks from Latin America came to the US, and it's important to note that this was not the intent of the act. When Congress passed the Immigration Act, they were thinking it would increase immigration from Western Europe. In fact, that was not what happened. And many Asians in the US today are here because either they came here under that Immigration Act, or they are the descendants of somebody who came here because the doors to America were open because of the 1965 Immigration Act. So just for a little bit of context, during this time, during this history of sort of exclusionary and discriminatory laws, we also have a fair amount of violence. So in 1871, we had the Chinese massacre here in Los Angeles. And if you look at photos from that time, there are pictures of nooses hanging from trees in Los Angeles and Chinatown. Soon after, in 1885 and 1887, there are massacres of Chinese miners. They were killed by white miners who were afraid of the economic dislocation they thought that the Chinese miners posed to them. In 1900, we had the scapegoating of the Chinese during the bubonic plague. I highlight that because it is the parallels between what happened then and what has happened in the last couple of years here in the US in regards to COVID are really sort of startling. You wouldn't have thought that something that happened like that then would happen again today, but it has. And I encourage you to watch, if you have a chance. There is a documentary called Plague at the Golden Gate. It's a PBS documentary. And it sort of goes through what happened during that outbreak of the plague. And it's really good. And the parallels are just sort of uncanny to what has happened now. Most folks know about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Far less known is the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. Vincent was a young man of Chinese descent. He lived in the greater Detroit area. And this was a time when the Detroit auto industry was struggling because of competition from the Japanese auto industry. And so just before Vincent's wedding, he went out for his bachelor party. And during that bachelor party, he got into an altercation with two white men who were suffering from economic dislocation, and they blamed the Japanese auto industry, and they took Vincent to be Japanese. And so in that altercation, they blamed him for what was happening to them. Even though Vincent was not Japanese, he had no connection to the auto industry. And they beat him to death with a baseball bat. And the thing is, neither of these two men who murdered Vincent ever spent time in prison. And the aftermath of this galvanized the Asian American community. They sort of realized that if they didn't stand up for themselves, that the US government certainly wasn't going to at that time. And so a lot of the organizations that we see today that are working in the AAPI space sort of stem from that time. A lot of the organizing that we see is a sort of they're direct descendants from that event and the aftermath of that. So again, after 9/11 in 2001, there's a lot of racial profiling of anyone who looked or appeared to be Middle Eastern, Arab, South Asian, Muslim, Sikh. One of the first civilians killed in the US after 9/11 was a Sikh man. He was wearing a turban, and folks who didn't know any better, they assumed he was Muslim. They blamed him for 9/11, and they killed him. And it happened a few times, I believe, after that. Again, in 2020, we see the rise of anti-Asian hate. Folks are being blamed for something that they had nothing to do with. They just happen to look a certain way, and people are yelling at them, blaming them, committing violence against them. Most of you know about the shootings in Atlanta last year. And then again this year, in the first half of this year, we saw some quite horrific attacks. There were several in New York City. There was one in San Francisco just recently. And there were some shootings in Texas in several salons owned by Asian American women that appeared random, but the community certainly feels that they were targeted in those because the shootings were only at salons owned by Asian American women. So this slide is a little bit disturbing, but it's important to read these things. These are reports that folks have shared with us on our website. And I'm just gonna stop talking for about a minute or so you can read some of these reports that people have sent in to us. So some of these stories are pretty hard to read. Unfortunately, they are fairly typical of some of the stories that we receive. A number of people are experiencing some of these exact same situations, and we see them sort of repeatedly throughout our reports. In the aggregate, what this looks like is that since March 2020, we've received over 11,000 reports. The vast majority of them are not crimes. It's important to acknowledge that. They don't meet the threshold of a crime. Oftentimes they are considered protected by the First Amendment as free speech, although it depends on the context where this happens. But they are extremely hurtful, and they're quite traumatic. So imagine going into a store to go pick up milk and some stranger comes up to you and starts yelling at you that you brought the virus, that you are the virus. It's pretty harsh, and it leaves a mark on folks. More than half of our reports are reported by women. We don't necessarily know if that's because women receive more hate, or if they feel more comfortable reporting to us than men do. So that's something in our data that we need to explore a little bit further in the next few years. Right now, from our data reports, 2/3 of the incidents are reported by East Asians, but there is other survey work done by other organizations that shows that Southeast Asians and South Asians receive as much or more hate than East Asians. But again, that's sort of a data problem. We need to figure out how to capture as much data as possible and as accurate data as possible. We know that verbal harassment is the most common type of discrimination. We know that it often occurs in publicly accessible places. So on a public street, on a public sidewalk, in a commercial business where anybody can come and go, and on public transit. So those are the places where it's happening. What drives it? So we know that political rhetoric drives a lot of anti-Asian animus. Politicians have a large bully pulpit, and when they speak, people listen. So we know that this rhetoric comes from both Republicans and Democrats. It's not limited to one party. It does come more often from Republicans, we find. But I just want to highlight this one campaign ad from Tim Ryan. He's a sitting US Congressman from Ohio running for Senate there. And he has a campaign ad where in the first 10 seconds, he says China 8 times. It's us versus China, it's us versus China. And he sees it as advocating for economic resiliency in the US. But what happens is that his rhetoric filters down. And folks who see that, everyday ordinary individuals, hear that and they lash out against people who they perceive to be Chinese. And we see it a lot in the reports where folks say, go back to your country. They say, make a lot of anti-Chinese remarks, regardless of if the person is Chinese or not. So it does matter, it does have an impact. Some of the effects, I'm just going to touch on one in the mental health area. We have a report on our website that if you are interested in this topic, I would encourage you to go take a look at it. But the one data point I want to highlight is that through a survey, we found that AAPIs who experienced racism are far more stressed by anti-AAPI hate than by the pandemic itself, which is pretty startling when you consider like how severe this pandemic has been. To be more afraid of racism is pretty startling. So we do hear that folks are afraid to go out. They're afraid to go to the store because if they've already received some racism, just sort of out of the blue because they were shopping, you know, it's hard to put yourself through that sort of situation again, right? You wouldn't willingly or voluntarily do that in many cases. So we know that these things are out there and that we need to sort of address the mental health challenges as well for victims and survivors. Our partners at a survey firm called Edelman conducted a survey asking AAPIs what they saw as the solution. So they overwhelmingly selected education, community-based solutions, and civil rights legislation and enforcement. And that dovetails nicely with our 3 core areas of civil rights to enforce current civil rights laws, to expand civil rights laws, to enact community-based safety measures, and to further educational equity. And educational equity is really important because if folks don't know the history, they don't quite understand the gravity and they don't understand the context. And it's really important to remember that AAPI history in the US is US history, right? It's not some history from outside the country. It's the history of folks in the US. And so it's a part and parcel of the US history that we currently learn. Very quickly, the way we go about our work is that we collect data and conduct research, and that informs our policy and advocacy work, which we try to use to build capacity and to change narratives. We are really interested in changing the conversation. We need to shine a light on what's going on because a lot of times folks, especially folks in power, they don't realize, they don't know, they haven't paid attention at this granular level. So it's really important to share stories and to collate these stories and present them to policymakers and people in positions of power. Very, very quickly, I'll run through this slide, but I just want to emphasize the importance of resistance and solidarity and collaboration and coordination. The things that we're fighting for, other groups are also fighting for them too. And people have fought for them before. We are the beneficiaries of some of the earliest AAPI organizing groups in this US. They knew that if they didn't fight for their rights, nobody else would. So they got started in organizing, and throughout history, folks have organized to fight for their rights. And it's really important to stand with others because everybody's sort of fighting for the same expansion of civil rights and recognition. And we have benefited from many of those groups also supporting us in the last couple of years in terms of highlighting some of the hate that we see so that there's a wider spotlight on it, and also in supporting some of the legislation that we're trying to push through, certainly in California. So what can you do to help? Support and empower your AAPI peers, advocate for your community to take a stand against hate, whether that's at school, in athletic leagues, in arts communities, if it's at your local city council. We have some resources and safety tips that you can look at on our website. And if you have experienced any of this hate, or if you know anyone who has, please report or encourage others to report on our website, because as I said, we collect this data. A lot of folks think it's, you know, a one-off incident when they're on the receiving end of it. But when we collate all these reports, we can shine a light and say, hey, this is a widespread, pervasive problem. And local city leaders look at it, county leaders look at it, states look at it. And we know that folks in the White House are looking at our reports and our data. So people are starting to see what is happening. And it's important to keep the spotlight on so that that measures can be taken to rectify some of the issues we're seeing. Finally, you can support AAPI organizations. And I just very quickly want to say thank you to you guys, because I think you guys held a fundraiser earlier in the year and you donated some of the proceeds to stop AAPI hate. So we really appreciate that. And I will just leave you with this notion that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, those who organized before us, those who used their voice, and we lay the table for those who follow us. What we do now will matter a generation from now, 2 generations from now, because our population's growing, right? If we don't do something now, if we don't start to do something now, things won't get better. But if we start, we can at least start to make a change. So with that, I'm sorry I've taken up a lot of time on our limited 40 minutes. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to take your questions. If you'd like to share any of your stories, anything that you've experienced, I'm happy to hear that as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ayush.
Thank you so much, Karen. We really, really appreciate it. I think the part that was very interesting to me was just how like history repeats itself, as we've seen through the bubonic plague, and how the treatment of Asians has changed through then, and how it's kind of repeated with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, and Karen will go ahead and answer them. Sabrina, do you have anything to add in the meantime?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for thank you to Kiran for providing such an informational presentation. I hope that everyone can go back and look at the recording to also more thoroughly look at the information she's provided on the slides, because understanding our history as a part of why we are living in the world that we live in is, I think, really crucial to how we can understand ways to move forward. So thank you for that. And I think we have a question in the chat here. So if Kiran, you want to read that and answer it, that would be great.
Sure. And before I do, I just want to say we just recently published a report on our first 2 years of data. So if you want to look at any of our reports, I would guide you to that one in particular, because it sort of is a very good summary, and then you can look into some of the more detailed reports that we have. But Hannah's question is, back in the 1900s, were there any efforts made by US political figures to stop the harassment and killings? My understanding is no. There were probably basic efforts in terms of, if there's an immediate instance of violence, law enforcement will usually at some point come and put it down. But usually that's often after the damage has been done, right? People have already been hurt, the violence has already happened. And so there wasn't really sort of a consistent advocacy campaign to say, hey, folks, you need to cool it down, right? This is not okay. This is not acceptable. You can't lash out at people who look differently. So there was no sort of widespread effort by political leaders to stop the harassment and stop the killings. Sure, Jason, go ahead.
So I just have a question about like the political like connection with discrimination by the normal people, because like you talked about how policy that's like anti-China, that's like politically, like economically, we're in that competition. Like we're always in that competition in these years. Like I just want like, can you clarify like the direct link to how discrimination in society, in like daily life of civilians, connect to like this policy?
Sure. So there's certainly a competition between nations, between and among nations, in terms of geopolitical competition, in terms of economic competition. But how we talk about that competition really matters. So in the case of China, there are certainly solid reasons to criticize the current government in China, but it does take some nuance, right? Because when you just say it's us versus China, it's us versus China, like Tim Ryan did in his campaign ad, it's a very general sort of statement. It's not talking about particular policies or particular practices. And most folks are not paying attention to the nuances, right? They don't know about a particular economic policy or a particular geopolitical effort. And so that gets lost in the conversation. And so folks who are just going about their lives, they sort of internalize this, in this case, an anti-China attitude. And we see it in the reports that we receive, because people will, one of the most common things that people report to us across all ethnicities is go back to your country, right? Folks who may have been born here receive that. People who've lived here for decades receive that. And so politicians need to use their bully pulpit with nuance. They often don't, but there's sort of a push to get them to do that. I think the State Department has some language that they recommend. I don't know that many US politicians follow that, but there's some awareness of it in some parts of